In 1946, under the international and domestic circumstances of the time we had covered in the past several lectures, the ruling Republican People's Party, which had been established right before the declaration of the Republic on the 29th of October 1923, in September 1923, as People's Party, after the Republic became Republican People's Party, Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi. In Turkish, and I'll use the acronyms in Turkish to refer to it as I have been doing so here. It functioned as the one party or the single party of the one-party system, which of course is an authoritarian practice, not a democratic one. And in 1945, Republican People's Party government decided to introduce new legislation which enabled opposition political parties to be established and seek votes in the 1946 elections. Several parties were established, but among them, the Democrat Party emerged as the most attractive party in the eyes of the voters, and the Nation Party which was also established by the ethnic Turkish nationalists, survived the turbulent politics of the 50s and 60s, converted into another political party organization by 1965, changed its name to Cumhuriyetçi Millet Partisi, Republican Nation Party, in the 50s, and then reverted back to MP, then became Republicanist Peasant Nation Party, Cumhuriyetçi Köylü Millet Partisi, and then joined with the Nationalist Action Party in 1965, which I will refer to later on. But in the 1950s, two major parties, Republican People's Party and the Democrat Party, emerged in the first multi-party system to function as the government and the main opposition parties. The Democrats won the elections after 1950, and the Republican People's Party got the second highest number and percentage of the votes, and therefore constituted the main opposition party throughout the 1950s. In 1946, the elections were not free and fair. The 1946 elections were monitored by the bureaucrats of the Ministry of the Interior, and therefore the governor's offices in the provinces played a major role as a result of which there was blatant rigging in the election, and it was severely criticized by all political parties other than the Republican People's Party in government. And the opposition parties requested that elections are to be supervised by the judiciary through the establishment of an election council, which got into effect in 1950. Besides, the vote counts were public in 1950 for the first time. In 1946, the election results were counted in secret, and therefore it opened up for vote swapping and blatant rigging under the circumstances. And secret ballot was introduced in 1950 and has been kept ever since as a practice, so that people could vote in secrecy to avoid any kind of intimidation, threat upon the knowledge of the vote or the direction of the vote by those in power. So 1946 election results are not public. We still do not know. We know the distribution of the seats. However, these percentages of the votes have been debated ever since. So 1946 elections could be considered as the last authoritarian elections rather than the first democratic or multi-party elections. 1950 was the first free and fair elections in recent Turkish history, and they produced the result you see on the screen. Republican People's Party got a little less than 40% of the vote. Democrat Party got a little more than 50% of the vote. The election rules were majoritarian in principle. Therefore, in multi-member electoral districts, where each province had multiple seats, more or less coinciding with the proportion of the people living in each province, the political party that had the most votes got all the seats, as a result of which there were gross disproportionality in the distribution of the seats in the parliament as opposed to the vote shares of the political parties. So with 53% of the vote, or roughly 53% of the vote, the Democrats were able to get 85% of the seats. With 39% of the vote, the Republican People's Party was able to get only about 14% of the vote. Less than half. Therefore, the front-runners' seats were multiplied by almost 2, and the other seats were eroded very rapidly into much smaller percentage than their vote shares. As a result of which, after the vote, for the next 4 years in the tenure of the Grand National Assembly, the imbalance was a daily routine which was recognized by the elites, and the relations between the government and the opposition were established on the basis of the seat shares rather than vote shares. Therefore, the opposition became a marginal force in the Grand National Assembly again after 1950. And this imbalance, this proportionality between the two sides, created the impression of a revolutionary change in the system, And this was referred to as a white revolution of 1950, where one establishment was kicked out of the government, another was brought in. Indeed, there was a major shift in the vote tallies and the direction of the vote from the Republican People's Party of the earlier period, where it was the hegemon and determined who won until 1950, to the ousting of the Republican People's Party from government and its replacement by the Democrat Party from 1950 onwards. Republican People's Party had been in charge from 1923 until 1950, and these were the very difficult years of the establishment of a new political system on the ruins of an old one, married with some new policies of recreating an understanding of national identity which had not existed earlier, establishment of a new nation state within a territory which was carved out by fighting out of the rubble of the Ottoman Empire, and at the same time of two major economic calamities. 1929 Great Depression, which created a huge destruction in Europe, North America, and all the developed capitalist economies of the world, where markets crashed and huge dislocations occurred, which was married with rampant unemployment, which pushed extremist political parties into clashes first, conflict later, and power eventually in Europe. Almost perhaps one or two countries were saved from this kind of right-wing swing in European politics, some Scandinavian countries, and Britain. The rest came under the rule of authoritarian regimes, in Spain after a civil war, elsewhere after a warlike bloodletting which took place in Italy and Germany especially, and eventually both countries established totalitarian right-wing regimes. So it was in this environment of economic downturn and calamity that the Republican People's Party stayed in power and absorbed all the negative influences of economic oscillations in the world. And then came the Second World War and a war economy, which also introduced a very hard time for all countries in Europe, although Turkey did not participate in the war, on the Turkish economy as well. And during this period, as I will cover later on, the changes in political economy exacted a huge price for the rural population of Turkey, the peasants, who suffered dearly from the winter of 1942, which was an awful winter, all the way to 1944. And it was the major effect of that that pushed the Democrats into power, Republicans into opposition. It was the economy, after all. The stark conditions of the economy that brought one calamity after another, although not homegrown, but imported from international economics, into the Turkish economy, it was the government that was blamed, rightfully so. And the people who lived through this period never forgot about the 40s. So a group of politicians split from the Republican People's Party and established the Democrat Party. So in a sense, the Democrat Party came out of the Republican People's Party fold. So did the Millet Partisi, and these were the relatively right-wing politicians in the ranks of the Republican People's Party that split from the political party. The Democrats were mainly representatives of the large landholders. In fact, the Prime Minister, Adnan Menderes, owned a huge swath of land in the Menderes River basin in Aydın, Söke, actually. And so did many others, who the peasants seem to have loved to vote for in this period. And they emerged as the option of the dominant rural voter base of Turkey. Approximately 3 out of 4 voters were peasants, and they overwhelmingly voted for the large landholders political party of the Democrats, who followed liberal policies. And from 1950 up until 1953, Turkey went through a very robust economic development, partly, again, to international circumstances. The Marshall aid that started to pour into Turkey increased its pace after 1950s, in the early 1950s, and the economy benefited, so did the government. So in 1954, their vote share increased to new heights, a record that has never been repeated by any other political party, to 58% almost, 57.6% of the vote. And of course, this majoritarian electoral system delivered about 93% of all seats to the Grand National Assembly to the Democrats. And with all 35% of the vote, the Republican People's Party was able to get about 6% of the seats in the Grand National Assembly. The imbalance between the two became enormous. It almost looked as if no opposition existed in the country from 1954 through 1957 in the Grand National Assembly. This had completely degenerated the relationships between the opposition and the government in the Grand National Assembly. The government started to develop a style of presumptuousness, hubris, looking down upon and condemning Republican People's Party, and becoming condescending in their attitude towards the opposition, and the opposition became increasingly radicalized, abrasive, and assertive, forceful, attacking the Democrat Party all this time. Ironically, in the 1940s, it was the Democrats who had argued that the election system should be converted from majoritarianism of the 1920s and 30s and 40s to proportional representation. However, when they came to power and discovered that this majoritarian system delivered them huge majorities where they could rule without any hindrance, fully arbitrarily, as they wished, they loved the election system that they had criticized severely in the 40s. And this time, in the 50s, it was the Republican People's Party spokespersons who started to ask for proportional representation, which they had not in the past embraced. Had they embraced it in the 1940s and changed the system in 1950, again the Democrats would have been in power, but not with the kind of preponderance, almost hegemonic predominance. But the relationship between the two would have been much more proportionate. And perhaps they could have somehow learned to develop some kind of style of working together in a relatively civilized and humane environment. Instead, as Fred Fry's and others' articles describing 1950s indicated, they showed the first case of people hating each other's guts, who cannot come together, talk together, consider the others as enemies, and tried everything in their power to make sure that they are locked out of the system for good and relegated to a position of losers and be humiliated in their loss as well as being in the opposition, which was not necessarily conducive to democracy and did not bode well with democracy in Turkey. Now in 1957, as you can see from the statistics, suddenly the vote shares started to look different. Republican People's Party got more than 40% of the vote for the first time, and the Democrats got less than 50% of the vote for the last time. If you read the papers of 1957 after the elections, you will hear and you will read and almost hear the Democrats talking how this could be. They are the party and the government of the people, meaning the peasants, who happen to be the preponderant voting bloc in Turkey. How could they not vote for their landlords, but vote for these awful, faceless, callous bureaucrats who had been ruling them with such condescension for so many centuries, and especially since the beginning of the Republic? Well, in 1955, the country got into a recession. And 56 was worse. 57 was horrible. In fact, they pulled the election date to 1957 and went for early elections 1 year ahead of schedule to avoid a greater calamity of losing more votes in 1958. The Turkish lira lost its value dramatically. In fact, 1957 election was the juncture which brought new circumstances into the Turkish economy. The Turkish lira was devalued for 330% in one night. People lost their purchasing power by 330%. They became pauperized, dropped classes, especially the bureaucrats who were getting their paychecks from the payroll as salaries and were in no position to negotiate their wages, lost huge chunks of their salaries. They ran into difficulty paying their rent, grocers, or greengrocers, or butchers, for that matter. Suddenly there was a big loss of income experienced by these people who were supposed to be running the government. It hit them the worst. Among the worst hit were the military at the same time, who had not yet established their special places of dwelling, as is the case today. As you know, now, as had been the case since the 1960s, the military live in apartments separated from the rest of the population. Not so in the 1950s. We had officers who lived as neighbors to us, and they worked in their bureaus as anybody else did at the time. So these people could no longer afford to live in certain parts of the city, and they had to move out into the banlieues of the city, the suburban areas where rent was more affordable. But this is a downward social mobility for these people. They lost standing in society, and they didn't take it very lightly. And the Democrat Party missed all of this. The economy is now in their hands, was getting the same kind of shock that the Republicans had experienced in the past because of international influences. Well, this time it wasn't that much international influence, more of a downturn because of the changes in the weather pattern, not enough snow on the ground, not enough wheat, barley, other cereal production, and therefore the kind of intake by the peasants dropped dramatically. And Turkey was still an overwhelmingly agricultural economy, suffered because of all of this. And Turkey had started on the road to industrialization, but not enough industrial establishment had been erected by the time to compensate for all these losses in the agricultural economy of the country. And free trade practices brought in by the Democrats, liberalization of trade did not necessarily improve the export performance of the economy. A gaping trade deficit emerged in the 1950s, as a result of which Turkey needed hard currencies, foreign reserves, as a result of which Turkish lira started to lose its value dramatically in a very short period of time. And with the devaluation of the Turkish lira, imports became much more expensive, and certain commodities could not be found. Of course, most critically, medicine, which had to be imported from abroad. So under these circumstances, people decided to change their minds in voting for the Democrat Party and switch to the Republican People's Party on economic grounds. But that's not how the Democrats interpreted the situation. The bureaucrats who they had been battling with all this time, who they never trusted, who they thought were by nature Republican People's Party supporters, found a way of rigging the elections, which they could not notice. They must have stolen the votes of these people. How could the peasants vote for the Republican People's Party and not vote for them? So under these circumstances, they turned against the Republican People's Party with a certain kind of vengeance, and established investigative committees, and started to prosecute and even persecute members of the Republican People's Party in the Grand National Assembly. And the relations between the two groups went from bad to worse after 1957. And it took about 2 years for these relations to lead to a breakdown of democracy. Turkish democracy has broken down for the first time. It was sort of mended, repaired, due to an air accident in Gatwick Airport in London, where the Prime Minister's plane crashed. And miraculously, the Prime Minister was found on top of a tree, alive and saved. He was greeted as if he were a saint. You know, sort of a period. He was greeted by the opposition leader, İsmet İnönü, and they shook hands, which was a big event, in the train station of Ankara. Ankara Garı, and the relations between the two parties seem to have become a little warmer, but only briefly. They degenerated very soon, and the Republican People's Party almost walked out of the Grand National Assembly, hit the roads, and started the campaign in the roads against the government. And the government tried to stop them from campaigning against the Democrat Party government. For example, their train entering Kayseri was stopped by the military troops. Inanı walked down from the train, walked directly to the colonel in charge of the soldiers. He said, "Look, I'm walking to the city. You have the option of shooting to kill me or let me go." And he started walking. And if you look at the newspapers, you will see that this colonel with a gun in his hand could not shoot and kill the guy. He was, after all, a hero of the War of Liberation. These are all irrational policies, ideological, emotional, but wrong, essentially. It antagonized the opposition further. And it created a relationship between the two that could not be contained in a democratic competition any longer. It took about another 6 months before the country experienced its first military coup. At the time of the coup, there was no working democracy in Turkey. So all this argument that Menderes was a great Democrat who was toppled and then was martyred as a great champion of democracy is a myth. It's an ideological wrapping of the right wing in Turkey. That is not the reality. That's not what happened. He had completely undermined the democracy that brought him to power. He had indeed hijacked the democracy, turned it into a one-party government. Turkey, by 1959, in the Grand National Assembly, had two one-party governments. One in the opposition, one in the government. And intolerance for opposition continued throughout the 50s. And it increased after 1957, not before. And this is a big problem, which this country is handing down to your generation as well. How do we make these elites whose chemistry do not mix, they hate each other, if they get the chance they are ready to kill each other, act as Democrats? We haven't found an answer to it yet. And today we are exactly in the same position. And this is not a new problem, though. It's been with us all along in the 50s. Couldn't fix it. We thought that we could fix it if we could bring in a constitution that dropped majoritarianism. In its place, bring in proportionality, plurality, and a pluralist environment which enabled better representation of different ideologies, different voting blocks in the country, where there are many. For as you very well know, the country is divided along religious, secular lines once, sectarian lines between Alevis and Sunnis twice, between the Kurdish nationalists and others a third time, which creates at least 6 voting blocks with overlaps. Then there are class differences which are not properly observed, which were entangled in urban-rural differences, where earlier studies on voting behavior paid a lot of attention to, which are not important any longer. There's hardly any rural left around. Rural part of the population is now less than 20%. A huge swath of population has moved from the rural areas to the urban areas. Well, now the voting bloc that is the most important and determining voting bloc is the urban poor. They are approximately 50% of the electorate, and they determine who wins under these circumstances. So it's the peasants versus the rest, urban, rural at the same time. Differences in the past, no longer true. Now it's the sort of urban poor, not necessarily the proletariat as the Marxists would call it, but more like lumpen proletariat. No employment, no career, no job definition, not much education. Huge group of people, which I showed you last week, as a major determinant in voting for especially Justice and Development Party en masse, determines the results. That is now the most important voting bloc in the country. So that versus those with professional business careers, those with proletariat who have regular worker careers, versus these unemployed masses and a small group of peasants. That's the new social class picture of the country. And that picture creates a strategic position for the urban poor, if properly mobilized, now becomes the most important determinant of Turkish politics. So there are many voting blocs with overlaps. Cultural divisions, ideological divisions, class divisions produce these results. There weren't that many. However, by 1961, a new election formula was introduced, one known as the largest average formula of proportional representation, which was invented by a mathematician from Ghent University by the last name of D'Hondt. Our political elite has fallen in love with D'Hondt. From 1961 up until now, Turkey has followed D'Hondt's formula, which produces proportional results in comparison to the majoritarian results of the earlier time. We still have large districts, multiple seats, except in 2011, for the first time, one province, an electoral district, has lost so much population that it is left with only one seat, Bayburt. That's the only single seat electoral district Turkey has. There, of course, the rule becomes plurality by essence. The one who gets the most votes win. Actually, the D'Hondt formula works very simply by dividing the total number of votes the political parties get by 1, 2, 3, until the total number of seats in the multi-member electoral district is filled. So what you do is divide the votes that the political parties get, first by 1, then by 2, then by 3, the same votes. So if this got 10,000, this 9,000, this 8,000, 6,000, and 3,000, what you will do is first divide these by 1, then by 2. Then by 3, the original numbers. Not the second line, the first line. Then by 4, then by 5, however many times is necessary. Then you rank them in descending order. The biggest, 10,000. Next, 9,000. Next, 8,000. Next, 6,000. Next, 5,000. Next, 4,500. So if you have 6 seats to fill, A gets 2, B gets 2, C gets 1, D gets 1 seat. among these 5 political parties. Party A gets 2 seats, Party B 2 seats, Party C 1 seat, Party D 1 seat. So there's a certain proportionality. But of course, the party that is the front runner is slightly rewarded better than other political parties. If you have many more seats, you will discover that the first party gets 3, whereas the others may be simply confined to 2 seats at most for the rest of them. So it rewards the front runner, but not to the extent as the earlier ones. Now, this produced a highly competitive environment for political parties, and this lowered the threshold for them to enter the Grand National Assembly. And as you can see, you know, a political party that could get about 3% of the seats, votes, could get about 3.3% of the seats. They got seats in comparison to the votes. This nation party, which had now become a Republican peasant nation party, was able to get into the Grand National Assembly with only 2.2% of the vote. Consequently, the vote shares and the seat shares became highly proportional. But this created a fragmented party system outside of the Grand National Assembly and inside the Grand National Assembly. And by 1970s, the votes are so split evenly across various voting blocks, 30%, 33%, 12%, almost 1%, 5%, 3%, 12%, 1% across the political parties, and independents getting 2.98%. Individual members running in electoral districts are called independent candidates. They're independent of political parties, no party ticket. So look at this distribution. 6, 7, 8 political parties got representation in the Grand National Assembly. And this required some form of what the British call a hung parliament to operate in a fragmented party system to establish some kind of coalition among these elites who hate each other's guts. Unless you solve that problem, you're not going to solve the rest of the problems. Because these coalition governments did not work. Did not work well. Even today, a lot of people are campaigning against coalition governments. We don't want coalition governments. We are ready to live under any kind of tyranny. We will accept it. No coalition government. It is worse. That's the image that people got. Wrongfully so. Because the propaganda against these coalition governments, supported by the big business in Turkey and the media that they controlled, were so damaging that it is now automatically believed that if we have coalition government, nothing will work. Well, there is some truth in it, but not much. I have compared from 1946 to the end of the century, 1999, coalition and party governments. And my results, published in a book as a chapter, indicate that there is no difference between coalition and party governments in terms of the inflation rate, trade deficit, unemployment, budget deficit, and what have you. They're exactly the same. The economic performances are more or less the same. There have been major accomplishments of the coalition governments in Turkey as well. Yes, it was the last coalition government that experienced the economic meltdown, financial crisis. But that financial crisis had been coming, irrespective of who came to government and who served in the government. It did not occur because of them. It occurred because of economic reasons. There was an Asian crisis in 1997, a Russian crisis in 1999, which had a damaging effect, and patronage politics in Turkey, domestically, which combined to create fragile banks who were involved in kleptocratic policies, not too different from many other institutions today, under one party, one single party in government. And this created a certain fragility, and the financial crisis occurred in 2001 after two shocks in 1999 and 2000. But it was the coalition government that solved the problem, established a working economy, and handed it on a golden platter to the Justice and Development Party, which reaped all the benefits. They showed the prudence and acumen of running Kemal Dervish's reforms smoothly. That is something we have to credit them with, but nothing more than this. But this picture, therefore, when the 1961 Constitution is considered operating with two chambers, Senate, as well as the National Assembly, Millet Meclisi, lower chamber Millet Meclisi, upper chamber Senate, with a constitutional court, higher courts, checks and balances, and coalition government, had created a more democratic environment. In fact, if you look at international comparisons, these highly difficult periods of 1970s, at the end of which there was another breakdown, something like civil war occurring, late 1970s, has been defined by the Freedom House as a country experiencing freedom. Turkey was measured as a free country from 1973 until 1980. Today, Freedom House has declared Turkey at the end of 2012 not free. And was accused by the government of the time as being a sort of a clandestine organization. Insinuation for terror organization. Örgüt. He said, the Prime Minister himself said, the Freedom House is after all an örgüt, which in Turkey means some kind of an illegal organization involved in sinister, heinous acts, and should not be considered as correct. So it has produced a democratic environment. It has produced a fragmented party system. It has produced a working, liberal, democratic system. However, it hasn't fixed the problem. For Turkey experienced half a coup, which wasn't necessarily a coup made against the establishment, but it was a coup made also against what was happening in the military to stop young officers' movement once and for all, which they were successful at. But the real coup occurred in 1980 after the democratic system of the country was broken down again. So the political elites of Turkey, who are duly elected through free and fair elections, fail to operate in an environment that is conducive to democracy and make democracy work. Again, in 1980 came another coup.